Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. Today I'm joined by John Elbing, and he is in Switzerland, and I am here in New York. So, morning for me, evening for you. John, great to meet you, and
Great,
welcome
great.
to One in the Many.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. And yes, it's end of the afternoon for me.
Perfect. So, John, you're the founder of Standpoint and the creator of a methodology that you call story building. And you have a published book on story building. And as I understand it, your central idea is basically that most companies tell stories about themselves, while um, the companies that really succeed don't just tell stories, but they um, tell the story from the customer's standpoint.
Exactly.
And rather than making the founder or the company the hero, you focus on and argue that the customer should be the hero and the company should play the role of the guide, the mentor, or enabler. Would
Exactly.
that be accurate description of your purpose in life?
Exactly. That is my daily life, to be in stories and the other person's story. So I think I would start by saying, well, yeah, companies. I mean, you can understand. People are just caught in what they're doing, working on their stuff, working on with their clients, with their offers, with their products, with their things. And so when you say, "What do?" You say, "I do this, I do this, I do this." Um, but actually, the value you're delivering is a transformation of your customer. So I believe, yes, you should say, you know, the people we serve are in this situation, and this is how we help, and this is how, your life can be better. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's this idea that you want someone to say, "Oh, wow! I mean, that's for me." You don't want to have them have a catalog and sort of think, what do I do with all this? I think the second thing is I called it story building because if you look up storytelling, there's a gazillion tips and tricks out there. And so you start with a hook and you dance on your left foot and you do this and you do that. And it's a way of telling a story better in a more engaging way. But it all presupposes that you have the right story to tell. And I feel that often they don't. They'll tell this great story how they started in a garage and they're doing so well and they're doing all this great stuff. And the customer sort of says, "Well, yeah, but why do I care? Why is it for me?" And so this idea of flipping the script, telling your customer story, and customer, it's wider than customer. It's your audience's story. It could be your investor. It could be your, just your spouse. You want to convince her to go to the beach on vacation, not to the mountains. Somehow, you tell their story. And so it's called story building because I help them build the story. Then they can always use all the other tips and tricks to make it cute or make a website or stand on a stage or whatever it is. But the idea is you have to have the right story to tell first.
So this is interesting because I can see an immediate tension arises from the perspective of understanding, for example, one of the most successful companies currently is Apple. Would you agree?
Sure.
Yes. So,
I'm an Apple person.
right. So, so like billions of people on on this planet, right? And so the interesting thing to me is that Steve Jobs was the driving force of that success, and his partner is often in the background, right? So they started from the garage, and their focus wasn't the customer; the focus was the product. But the interesting thing to me is that by them focusing on the product, they were actually implicitly thinking of the customer. How are you going to use this product? What is it about using this product that makes it a utility, a success, right? So they weren't concerned about their contribution to the improvement of the product. They were concerned implicitly, although never explicitly stated in the beginning, how the customer interacts with the product. But then later on, especially after Steve Jobs came back from his exile, he he became famous in one of his presentation of the iPhone that he doesn't use consumer groups or whatever the terminology was, right? He doesn't ask the consumer or the potential consumer of a potential product whether they like it or not. He's focused only on the utility, functionality, capacity of that product. He wants to make the perfect product in his vision of the product. And now that entails that, in his view, the customer will benefit the most from his creation of that utility of the product. But he explicitly says, I don't care what you think the best product is. I'm going to tell you what the best product is, right? And so the tension arises that, in fact, what you are identifying is that he's basically saying, I love you, man, and I know I can show you a much better way of you interacting with this kind of products. Because right now in the market, you don't have a product that makes it easy for you, makes it good for you. I'll show you something that it's much better than what you can imagine being good. And so the BlackBerry was the default product that every businessman used. In fact, if you didn't have a BlackBerry, you don't classify as a businessman, right? And then the iPhone comes, no buttons, everybody rebels. It was like, oh, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. This is not going to work. And now we can imagine ourselves without any Apple product, right? That's so beneficial to us. So what I find fascinating and appears as a tension, but it could be interpreted either way, is this, it becomes more like a chicken and egg, right? So what is the primary drive of the creator? Am I going to be concerned with the consumer's process of his interaction with this creation that I'm offering as an exchange of value for value with somebody who appreciates it? Or am I concerned with the integrity of the product that will rise to the expectation of the consumer viewing it as valuable? You see what I'm getting at?
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that we started out talking about the story you tell, not what product you sell. And so I do find that this idea of telling your customer story is a way of being customer-centric in a real way, because you have to find a story where the person recognizes themselves, understands, and can project themselves into this better future. And so if your product doesn't match that story, you might have a problem with the product. I coach a lot of startups as well. And startups are all in that position of, I have something different that people aren't expecting or don't have yet or won't understand, but I think that it will solve one of their problems. There's this story about Ford, I guess, who asked, what do you want? People would have said, I want a faster horse. And so you don't necessarily ask people what they want in an abstract way, because we don't. But the idea is that, yes, Steve Jobs and or his team got into the user's shoes, said, what do I want to do? Why should this be completely different? So in their mind, they were very customer centric, but they knew that, asking a random person on the street to say, what does the next phone look like, wouldn't get them anywhere. And I find that, they had this Think Different campaign at the beginning, which being in Europe, and I'm surrounded with English speakers who are not first language English speakers. So they think different is a simple sentence saying you should think differently. They don't realize that it's grammatically incorrect, that the think different is a way of, was shocking at the beginning. For them, it's just that, it's close enough. So I thought that was interesting. But what they're saying is, they're not saying, look how many pixels on my screen or something like that. They're saying, you're a creator. At the beginning, they targeted designers and creative people, and you were part of this group of, you're not the gray box, boring people. You're the interesting person that's creative, and you think different. And so this idea of, they're telling the customer story, because I think, yeah, I'm someone that think different, or whatever. I'm not saying which is the best motherboard or what is the product. Simon Sinek, in his Why, go for the why. The original presentation of that idea of start with why, he took Apple as an example, and he says, it's, we want people to be creative and to have the tools that they want to be able to fulfill their thing. So we decided to create these tools, and we end up doing computers and phones and stuff, instead of saying hey, we're doing these great cool phones, because then you can be creative, so then you can express yourself. And that was his way of saying Apple was this ideal of where you could recognize yourself in this thing. In story building, what I've set up is that the idea that is, you go through 3 steps when you encounter a brand. And the first one I call recognition, and then perception, and then projection. And the idea of recognition is, when I see, I encounter a brand, it could be a billboard, a store, or a website, I sort of feel, is it for me? Do I recognize myself in this brand? So, if the brand says, young fathers are worried about what they feed their babies, if I'm a young father, maybe I wasn't worried yet, but I'll recognize myself in that. But if the company says, we do this, we do this, we do this, and you think, is that for big companies, small companies, is that for me? Is that, and it's up to me to figure that out. And if I was going to be, say you're a young accountant and you want to open your accounting practice, if you choose a niche and you say, we do accounting for medical professionals or gardeners or whatever it is, if I'm that gardener and I think, and I'm looking for all these accounting, and one says, I love you, I'll think, oh, wow, they know me, they work with people like me, and I've already established this level, a first step of trust, because I say, I see you, I understand you. Then the second step is perception. You have to get in the right category, and you have to have trust, and you have to really clearly understand. A lot of companies try to be clever, and being clever just makes it harder to understand. That's probably not the right thing. So usually companies can say what they do. You can probably do it better. But then there's a third step that I call projection, because I'm convinced with your offer, and then I say, but I'll have to, how do I buy it? And then do I have to install it? And do I have to learn? I'm using my old thing at the same, and I have all these things going around in my head. And then I hesitate and I think, okay, I'm going to do this, but I'll come back next week and I don't. So if at the end of your story, you can say, this is how it's going to happen. This is, how easy it's going to be. This is what the experience is going to be like. These are the other problems that it's going to solve. And imagine, close your eyes and imagine what your life will be if we do that. And this closes all those open questions. And and steps the person a few steps farther into that engagement. So the idea is you get kind of the better people interested, because it's only the ones that recognize themselves. You're talking to the right people, and then you get them to almost pre-live what you're doing, and that is a few steps closer to an actual engagement. So that was a long-winded answer to the Apple example, but there you go.
Well, I really appreciate you um, narrowing it down to these three principal processes that you identify in the story building: the recognition, perception, and projection. So these very important psychologically, because we've struggled for a long time as species to relate to the process of recognition, right? I mean, for a very long time, especially in the Western tradition, we have this relationship between um, authority and the subject under the authority. We have the king and we have the feudal lords and we have everybody else. So we have the few to the many relationship, and the few always come from position of power and authority. So they don't recognize the multitudes, right? And then the Enlightenment changed that. It went back to the Aristotelian understanding that to recognize another is to see yourself in that other. It's to have that reflection of the self in another self. And recognition becomes a very valuable tool to incorporate in your psychological relation with the world of others. And so you you have to be sensitive to the context of the other. I love you um, name of the company standpoint, because at any given time you stand in a point, and so you can see one's life as a standing point of your character, right? You exemplify what you stand for, and so it could be a momentary perception, but it could also mean a whole global perception. You wanted to say something?
Well, just about standpoint, you were talking about Apple. What I find is that taking the other person's standpoint is really important,
Yeah.
but having a strong standpoint yourself is
Yes.
just as important. And so for
Exactly.
Apple had this strong standpoint, but it was a reflection of their customer standpoint. And so it goes both ways.
So this speaks exactly to this connection, that the recognition. So me as a human being, it's easy for me to recognize an ant. An ant is difficult, and we don't know how they recognize things, but it will be difficult for me to conceptualize their manner of recognition of me as a human being against them. I don't know if they recognize me as a human being. I don't know their standpoint. I don't know their reference perspective. I don't know if they see me as a Mount Everest or they see me as a human being. Where I, as a human being, see them as an ant versus a fly, right? I can make the differentiation and distinction between the two, and I can view them in a similar magnitude of appearance. So the connection I see in that is that by recognizing something, you are affirming your understanding of who you are. Your recognition of yourself reflects the recognition of the other. Right? One of my professors in literature used to say, "It takes a genius to recognize a genius." And so I think that's speaks to your next progression, which is the perception, right? Your capacity to perceive is defined by the expansion of your recognition of how much you can recognize, how much differentiation and integration have you developed in your understanding of the world. And so, and the world of this process of product building for a particular group of people or for everybody, then becomes intertwined between your process of recognizing the world and the function of the product and the product itself. What kind of integrity will that product has in relation to serving that recognition in the user? And so um, if those parameters don't get clarified, the projection becomes difficult, becomes convoluted. And I think it's wonderful that you speak to that finality, which we know from Aristotle's identification of the four causes, right? The final cause is what gives explanation to the the efficacy process of the form that brings you down to the material that gave rise to the form. So all these four connected, and you identify it in a three stages: recognition, perception, projection. And so if I don't have clear recognition, if I don't have clear perception, the projection may suffer from confusion, and then that confusion will generate the procrastination, which will end up in ineffective action,
Mm-hmm.
or the action will be disengaged from the process of recognition and perception. It's just not sufficient enough for me to complete the process. So um, I'm very much interested in that process of projecting, because our projections, as you pointed out, in the context of segregating groups and classifying activities, gardener or medical practitioner, whoever they are. But our projections are based on our past experiences of what we've accumulated as an identity for ourselves and as purpose for ourselves. And then we evaluate our accomplished or accumulated capacity to this point and project for a future that will utilize this capacity in whatever purposeful form we seek to manifest it. And so the projection often carries uncertainty. And if you are building something, um, especially material, but even for services, like a lawyer should have a very clear projection as to what they are offering and how they are offering a resolution to something, right? Whatever the service is, it has to have that um, clarity of closure in order for me as a potential consumer of that process to understand exactly what I'm getting into. Um, does that?
Yeah, because I think that often, if you take the lawyer example, they're selling a process, they're selling a service, and you would want them to sell a transformation, a result for if I I'm in some problem and I need a lawyer to help me out. I don't. It's not what he's going to do or she's going to do or how many hours or this. It's, you know, how is our interaction going to happen, and what can I expect as, a better future. And I find that often it's more like, we do, it could be we do your, we conflict resolutions, we're a divorce lawyer or we're a tort lawyer or whatever it is, we're an accountant, we do your accounting. I don't want someone to do my accounting. I want to better run my business somehow. And I don't want, and that's part of this, all this flows, within, through stages. If you start by saying, you want to come out of your divorce in a better place, that's a different thing to say. Another lawyer will say, okay, we're going to gut them, and you're going to win. And those are two completely different, so probably some of the steps are the same, and you file the same paperwork and all this kind of thing. But what is the experience going to be like? What is the goal, and what is this transformation you're saying? And I find that's missing a lot.
Yeah. So I think that speaks to your focusing on the story building rather than the storytelling, right? Because the process is the same. I mean, whether I'll divorce you with a amicable, peaceful resolution, and not only between the two parties in dispute, but in your own peaceful departure from this experience as a result of the process, is the same storytelling. But to build a story in a peaceful manner, that takes a different approach to the issue, just the way you described the distinction of the um, s- filing the same paperwork with two different experiences. And I think that is very valuable in a sense that whatever we do, we are constantly building, we're constantly creating, even the most mundane and seemingly unimportant things in terms of activity that we do. If we see them as just, you know, eat your lunch to the kid or anything, it's just storytelling. But if you build a story of eating the lunch, then the kid will be much more involved and engaged in the process of eating his lunch. And I think that's very valuable.
I heard some stories, some parent stories,
Mm.
where this one mother would say, when the kids were losing their baby teeth,
Right,
and so she said, hey, each new tooth has a different taste, so that food you hated before, you might like it now. Try again, because, or something. Uh,
right, right. You,
and
you got to
well,
build the story.
there's a story there, yeah.
So, in stories, histories, right? It's a history of an experience, and in creating a new thing, you are generating a new account of experience that in the future will be history. And so, in building the story, I want to go back to this focus on the interaction between creator, product, and user. Because I think most of the confusion and potential conflict or short lived experience in the process of building value comes from the uh, inability of the creator to articulate the finality, the clarity of his creation. And so, if I focus solely on the consumer, or solely on the product, or solely on the satisfaction of my creation, I am missing an element of the whole process. And I was wondering if you have experienced in your interaction with startups, or with just in the business process, um, any of these fragmentation of the process and how that fragmentation affects everyone involved versus someone who is encompassing all aspects of the process and is encountering different set of challenges in that attitude or perspective.
What I found with working with storytelling, and that became story building, was the idea that first there's a part where a group aligns on a story. And so I did this workshop with, like, there were 10 people from a company, and I said, take a piece of paper and write down what your company does. And I had 10 different stories. And then they built a story together. And that created alignment, it created focus. You know, this is who here, these are the people we're serving, this is the outcome we're working for. So, you know, yes, the storytelling delivers a story that you can put on a website that hopefully will bring you customers, but it has a big impact internally on the focus and the alignment and how it works. You know, it's almost better than a mission statement. A lot of, you know, companies do this great mission statement and then put it in a drawer and it does nothing. But building that story from their customer's standpoint really, you know, becomes that mission. And I've had early stage startups that have this great invention, but they're not quite sure for who or for what or for things. And building that story with them completely transforms how they see their invention, because you know, it fits into someone else's story and how that will transform, you know, make their life better. So I found that, you know, there are moments when that building that story together can really, you know, help the company through a pivotal moment, a problem. You know, a lot of bigger companies have a marketing team and then a sales team. And when the sales don't do well, the salespeople think it's the marketing team's fault because the marketing isn't good enough, and the marketing people think that, what, we have these great leads, why didn't you go through? You couldn't. When they build the story together, and the marketing team has this story to use in all these different channels, but then that story is echoed through the relationship between the salesperson and the customer, and that goes all the way down, that facilitates that whole connection and stops it being two teams sort of against each other, but working together in a way that makes much more sense. And I've seen that really unknots a series of, you know, latent conflict and things between people in a company.
Yeah, you know, this reminds me of the books on Jack Welch that I was reading when I was developing my career on Wall Street in the 90s. And Jack Welch became famously successful at GE and turned GE into a powerhouse because he focused on the importance of the mission statement. And he changed from day one when he became CEO. He said GE will be number one in everything we do. Will be number one, period. And so he recognized the challenge of being number one attitude or internalization by everyone in a very large corporation. I mean, he had tens of thousands of people working for him. And so he devised something ingenious. He went back to understanding human relations as a social animal. And he said, well, the hunter gatherers didn't have larger than 100 and something people. And they were very efficient in their survival. And so he devised every department at GE not to exceed more than 136 people. And all of them had to talk to each other. There was no way that one division will work independent as an independent unit at GE. And that was the remarkable characteristic of his success, that he was able to integrate them under the banner of one mission. And so to be number one, you have to employ the success of your customer, of your product, of your own understanding of what you're doing as a team, as a company, as a member of the group. And um, of course, the internet diffused and diluted that message, because the internet broadened up the scope, the scale, and everything else. And GE today is nobody. Like nobody. I mean, our generation remembers GE, but youngsters, they have no idea what it is. And similar to IBM was the blue chip, and now it's like, who's IBM? Like, I know Claude, I know ChatGPT, I know Grok or whatever, Tesla, but Apple, but those old guys are gone. And Warren Buffett also spoke about this, that the cyclicality in that sense is that the leaders of 30 years ago are no longer. They've uh, there is no sustainability in holding the first place because of the evolution of um, technology and success and everything else. Now, Microsoft and Apple have been able to sustain that kind of leadership for a long time, and it makes them unique participants in the economy, where most everybody else has diminished in the capacity of maintaining leadership in terms of um, our daily activity, right? Yeah.
But so um, it just reminds me of like the Kodak example in the sense
Mhm.
that, and sort of the business school view of that was they were the a film company, they weren't an image company. So they invented the digital camera and stuff, but they said, no, 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 we're doing film. And that's really not taking your customer standpoint. The customer doesn't care. They want a beautiful picture. And if they had, and this idea that's very 90s to sort of say, we want to be number one. And being number one doesn't mean that you know, respect your customers. It doesn't mean you're innovative. It just means, you're big. And this idea that and these big companies somehow, if you become number one for an industry, a product range, a thing, and it's very hard to see the next thing coming. Nokia was the top of the world, and then they disappeared. Uh, and so you sort of you optimize for profitability, for market share, and you lose the agility and flexibility and openness to try new things. And I think Apple and Microsoft are really two different stories in the sense that Apple has been, you know, maybe less recently, but really at that forefront of they're not delivering computers, they're delivering this experience. Microsoft became sort of a monopoly that's still there, um, but no one is sort of saying they're it's the thing that everyone uses and everyone hates at the same time. So it's a kind of fragile situation, because you can imagine some tool, everyone has tried to replace the MS Office, but at some point, if I tell Claude to say make my PowerPoint deck, at some point you don't need Microsoft anymore. So sure, Copilot is getting better, and they're trying to hold on with that. um, Even Apple they're one of the rare ones that's not fighting the AI war like the others. What they're doing is to say, we have your life, your life is in your hand. So we're going to deliver AI connected to your life. We're going to when you're there and you say, "Hey, didn't I have an appointment?" Well, we see your emails and your calendar and your thing and your stuff, and you say, "Watch out! You promised your mom to go see her next week, but now you have a thing coming up." And so it's not about the greatest model, about the greatest thing, about coding. It's all that. It's how you fit into people's lives, and that's way different from the other views of how people are sort of building this thing and then wanting to make it. They want their thing to be number one instead of their wanting their customers to be number one somehow.
Yeah, I think I think this is very valuable in understanding that when you set yourself up for something, the colloquial expression of this is be careful what you wish for because you may get it. But in getting it, you arrest yourself in the completion of that. And that leads to complacency. You become complacent on your success of getting whatever you set out to get. But that's only temporarily. And if you want to capture the ongoing process, then um, your position on the ladder or on the podium is not important. The position in the degree of interaction is important. Are you still able to interact functionally and um, worthwhile? Does it generate meaning, that interaction, in the same way that inspired you to maintain motivation in creating that interaction?
And I think that's the big difference with the 90s. If you have a company today and hiring the younger generation and say, okay, our goal is to be number one, well, that's not the meaning they're looking for anymore. They're looking for to build something that has connection, that has meaning, that actually serves the people you're working for, that transforms lives, and somehow that could might be more sustainable than just this raw thing of wanting to be number one.
Yeah, and which in my mind speaks back to one of the most enduring um, uh, dictums that the ancients offered to posterity, and that is know yourself, right? So you want to understand who you are, what motivates you, what drives you to do the things that you do, and in that respect, go back to your first principle of recognition. You recognize yourself, but you also, that recognition, or the depth of the recognition of yourself, allows to recognize the other. And in return, you're allowed an entrance in a process that you generate through knowing who you are. And in that sense, I see this development of the artificial intelligence as amplification of where you stand, to put it in your terminology, because by integrating who you are, you're in a constant inquisitive um, stand of curiosity. You want to know how much, if you stand a little taller than where you are, you see more, right? You see farther away. And is it possible to go even higher? Can I go to the next hill up and see more valleys and more greater horizon? So you're constantly building, and this is where your story building comes in. It's not just telling, but building. And by building, you're actually telling the story that, hey, I was here at 500 meters. Now I'm at 1,000 meters, and the view is much better. Come up here.
Mhm.
Let's take you up there. And so it's not a matter of I got number one. No, I got a new plateau, new horizon. And then that horizon opens up. Oh, wow. Now that I'm here, I see that there is another hill over there that it looks higher. Let me go there. So you got to go down and up again. So it's a constant recursive process, which I called induction, integration, reduction cycle. And so you go from your observations to inducing general principles to organizing those principles into integrated coherent story, let's say it. And then you check the premises in this. So in order to check it, you got to go back to the beginning in order to go to a higher level order of understanding. And I think that's why your formulation of story building speaks to me more meaningfully, because it's not just telling the story. Telling the story transforms one's standpoint, to put it in your view, because I'm telling you something that your perspective may not have seen. But if we build together, if I build a different perspective for you rather than telling you about this perspective, then you may internalize it and becomes our story now. And that's a different experience.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, really, that switch from telling. When you said, when you started out by saying, you can, if you go higher, you see more. I was almost in the opposite direction, saying if you close your eyes, you can see more, because you have to listen and listen instead of talk, kind of thing. Um, and and you're not necessarily seeing, your audience or your customer or whoever, your stakeholder. What you're doing is you're seeing the world through their eyes.
Mm.
So it's a kind of this exercise, even if, for if you're listening, this idea, step back, turn around, look at yourself from the outside. Try to look at yourself as if you're not yourself, but you're looking from the outside. What do you see? Who are you helping? What do you offer? What transformation do you offer? I mean, is that, can you understand that? Because we see everything from our standpoint so much that to try to step out, really, I often, sometimes I can hear an audible click in people's minds when somehow they've turned around, and that's really rewarding.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's when I was coming up as an analyst on the street, one of the things I enjoyed doing was becoming a customer of the company that I was analyzing, if they were offering some product or service. And so by becoming a customer, you get to really understand um, their
Secret shopper.
claims. Right. So when they claim, we stand for customer service, well, let me test that. And um, and then you can really verify or negate their premises very easily, because you have experience now. And so being able to reduce um, conceptual frameworks to experiential level, it's very challenging, especially when we're dealing with more and more abstract formation of companies that offer more and more abstract services. I mean, we live in a so abstract exchange right now, that many average people, by average people, I mean many people that have limited um, exposure to functionality. So if I classify some people that work for corporations as an employee, regardless of your status, whether you um, at the beginning of your career in an advanced form or in a high level executive form, you are still limited within the system of interaction that corporation offers to you. And as a result of that systematic interaction of the process of the function that the company offers to the global economy, you develop certain routines that is very different from the routines developed by independent actors that generate their own systems and are not codified by external systems of organization. So they organize their own system of function. And so, of course, there's always some umbrella of organization that codifies your routine. But in one perspective, you are driven by the processes that are dictated to you, and the other one, you agree or disagree and choose or choose to follow or not to follow certain processes depending on where you stand, right? And in that manner, the sophistication of the abstract form of exchange today is such that a 20-something-year-old can be born in the US, go to Estonia, do business from Bangladesh or whatever. They can do whatever they want anywhere they want it, and they can just live off a backpack if they choose so, or they can uh, build a fortune just by being online without any physical product or anything like that. So when we get that abstract and that sophisticated, um, there's a danger that we may lose connectivity to that process of going down to the valley in order to go to a higher level. And um, so, in that sense, I think the element of building, it's crucially important to whatever activity we engage ourselves in. And never forget that um, all these advances are just tools to uh, specifically instrumentize some kind of activity that may not have been available to us in a previous generation or in earlier times.
Because I think when we talk about working in a corporation, and you're caught in a kind of culture and a certain process, there's a way you can exchange. There's a push towards the employer brand.
Mm.
You're not just the consumer brand, you're also the employer brand.
Mm.
And that goes through storytelling just as much. And so if you have an internal story, and it's a story that makes sense, that connects people, that aligns people, and that you really live, I mean, that is a way, and so that people coming in can recognize that and be part of that story, instead of saying, okay, I'm a cog and I have to fit in my little box, but to say, okay, this is the story we're building together. I found that's just as important as the story when you tell your customer story. Here you can tell your employee story, or somehow the company's story in that sense, as a collective way of seeing the world or the company or your mission or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, you become a culture ambassador, some corporations call it. Yeah. Um, so in your understanding of standpoint, do you see it as building a perspective or building a position of um, establishment or the interchange of the two?
So, so I guess how, if you go into kind of the more practical side of all this, why would a company hire me to do this? What is the impact? What is the experience I deliver, and what is the transformation and all that? It comes down to things that are a little bit more practical, I guess. And so, um, so part of it is, I sort of, companies come a little bit from the two sides. One is, there's something happening, and they need to step back and rebuild their story because they need to reconnect with their audience. It could be a merger, an MBO, it could be a new product launch, it could be something that's shifting. The market or the environment is shifting, and their story has to follow that. But it could also mean that they know where they're going, but somehow some come from the alignment focus perspective and then are happy to have a great story for their website, and others want the marketing copy somehow at the end, and then say, "Ooh, that was cool," because it also aligns the people and things like that. And part, I don't feel that I've invented something crazy unique. I just put words on it, and I've created a process that is a system, and you go through and you ask. Telling a story forces you to ask the right questions. Who are we talking to? What is important? What is less important? What is the focus? What is the angle? What is the thing? All this thing, and then you put it in a format. All stories are very formulaic. Someone said that of all the novels of the world, there's basically only 7 or 12 stories. They all boil down to rags to riches or whatever it is. And so there's a kind of a way of making the story where you walk people through the easiest order of information and things for them to follow along. And so it's this mix of this structure and sequence with, people know about their customers way more than they think. It sort of feels like a black box, but once you sit them down, there's a lot of insight in there, and there's a lot of connection, and people sort of, it takes away a barrier between them and the people they're serving. So I forget what your question was, but somehow this idea that it's it's almost a kind of a therapeutics process to go through for them to find themselves and to reconnect.
So yeah, I mean, I think you answered it in the beginning of your um, explanation, and I was focusing on whether it's a standpoint, is a perspective, or it's a position. But I think in your explanation, what it gave rise in my understanding is that people have people are challenged by the articulation of their knowledge. And I think what you're describing is that you bring out that articulation by stimulating that alignment among themselves. So perhaps if you had, as you pointed out, 10 people in the room, you have 10 different interpretation of that articulation. But at the end, they all come into one integrated uh, point point view or standpoint, and they stand on that um, articulation. So, and this to me is very interesting because articulation, um, comes from understanding the joint point, right? So, where exactly does this bone end and the other bone starts, and we articulate the difference, right? And there's some some I don't know what they are, like explanations or whatever, but uh, some ideas that the bones float in the body, right? Um, and articulation becomes important because when you have a general principle of guiding your action, if you don't have clear understanding of the differentiated elements of that principle, you can blind yourself, or you can, in my terminology, get misintegrated, be rigid on the principle, and not have um, position on the um, what gave rise to that principle. And so, in that regard, you'll be doomed to failure if you rigidify yourself. But if you become flexible in uh, figuring out the elements of the principle that give rise to your position, then you are coherent, you are organized, and you can develop a system of progressing your interactions. So um, I'm often surprised how successful people have difficulties finding the right uh, clear articulation of what they do. And in fact, um, at one point in my career, I was a trader and on Wall Street, and some of the most successful traders in my firm are terrible teachers. They could not teach you how to trade, and yet they would be very successful at what they do. And that speaks to the idea that they cannot articulate what they're doing. But
The
if
same with like college professors that are
right,
great in research, and then it's a disaster in front of students.
right. So if you can marry the two, then it's perfect, right? Um, I can create the platform on top of which I can enrich my articulation, refine it even more, give it a better definition, give it better, more richness, and encompass more in the process, and that benefits everybody. So it's a worthwhile pursuit.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So well, I think it's great to meet someone who has a solid standpoint and has been building a story. So I hope many people discover you more and more, and you have continued success in turning, uh, you know, how am I going to put this? Turn energies that have some kind of projection, but that trajectory is not uh, defined. Find a standpoint that they can focus on, um, you know, uh,
Connect two standpoints.
exactly, exactly, yeah, and in that connection, you build great value. So, so John, it was great meeting you.
Well,
I really appreciate that. We spent an hour of chatting together. I hope that was fun for you as much as it was for me.
absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's I know it's sort of I went up to another plateau to see this whole storytelling, story building uh, environment, and I do feel that sometimes you do go down to go up to a higher one.
Yeah, I
No,
mean,
interesting. Thank you for your time.
for I was just gonna say in conclusion, for you it's easy. You live in Switzerland.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much. Until next time, have a great one.
Okay, you too.